My name is Madeleine Dungy, and this is Victor Petrov. We're Max Weber Fellows here at the EUI, and we're speaking today with Arne Westad, who's professor at Harvard University. He spoke to us yesterday about his new book, The Cold War, A World History, and so today we have some follow-up questions based on that discussion. We want to start with a very general question about your career. So looking back, would you say that you were always doing world or global history, or would you say that that is a framework that you've sort of moved towards more recently?
It's a hard question to answer, really. I think to some extent I've always been doing world history in the sense that I've been preoccupied with global interactions. So from I started out doing this kind of stuff, I've been interested in figuring out how different parts of the world relate to each other. I probably would have characterized myself, however, as an international historian more than a world historian of world conventions, until about a decade ago or so. And the reason for that was mainly that my preoccupation when I started out was centered on interstate relations and political elites to a very high extent. And then gradually began to shift, I guess when I was doing a book back in the 1990s, late 90s, on civil war in China, it started moving more towards popular movements, participatory kind of organizations, and then gradually towards social and cultural experience. Now, I never entirely left the perspective of trying to understand this also within a world system of states. But it's become a very different kind of practicing history from what it was in Albania.
Thank you.
To follow up on this, and more, I guess, more to do with the book itself now, one of the case studies that you use is India, which appears as what you say is an alternative to the Cold War, the anti-Cold War states. So are there any other ways that you can tell the story of the globe after 1945? What other ways after the Cold War?
Yeah, so I think there are many alternative stories. There are many things that are happening, not just in the latter 20th century, but throughout the century, that could be privileged. I actually think less and less that the Cold War framework, even the way I define it predominantly as an ideological conflict, is necessarily at the center of that global experience. I think it's an important part of 20th century history, but it is one part. Right? I mean, you could talk about global ecological transformations. You could talk about the development of medicine. You could talk about profound cultural change, societal change. You could, of course, also talk about other kinds of global history developments, two world wars, global depression. You could talk about decolonization, European integration. You could talk about the rise of East Asia in economic affairs. So many other ways of looking at this. So this is, in a very deliberate, clear sense, one particular perspective. But what I'm preoccupied with in this book is to try to understand the set of issues that relate to the Cold War in a global ideological sense as world history, alongside the other developments that take place within the 20th century. So it's not about attempting to subsume everything else that goes on under a Cold War framework. It's rather to relate the Cold War to other things that are going on, that are autonomous in terms of their origin, but to a very high extent come to influence each other.
In your most recent book, and also in previous scholarship, you have demonstrated that the Cold War was actually a pretty hot and brutal conflict in a lot of the global south. And I wondered if you could talk about the political implications of the fiction that the Cold War was a contained or cold conflict.
Yeah. I think those implications, which are mainly wrong, are in many ways very damaging. I mean, they're damaging for contemporary politics today, with the main fiction being, and particularly from an American point of view, but also here in Europe, that the United States led the world during the Cold War in a period of relative stability, and with exception of Vietnam, which still looms large in the American imagination, or an absence of violent conflict. I mean, the opposite is of course true if, as you say, you look at this from the perspective of the global south. Or you could even argue to some extent if you look at it from a European perspective. I mean, different kinds of violence obviously in Eastern Europe, but still significant amounts of violence during that time period. But even that pales in comparison with Africa, with Southeast Asia, with China, to some extent Latin America as well. So putting that aside, I think is very damaging. I think it's something that is not very helpful for understanding the time period and the interactions that took place. It privileges a particular form of memory over other forms of memory, which is not good under any circumstance, but particularly bad when people's lives and daily existence are also impacted, by what went on during that time period. So in researching this book, I spent a lot of time outside of Europe and North America, and that's of course where this destructive impact of the Cold War is most clearly felt today, and with consequences that remain with us up to now. So understanding that on a global scale is very much what this book is about.
Well, one of the other things the book makes very clear is that bipolarity is very rare in world history and politics, and so why, if you can answer that, and also why was it that these two particular states, USA and the Soviet Union, managed to achieve this bipolarity?
Yeah. So the first one, and I know this sounds like a cop-out, the real answer is I don't know. I mean, I don't know why bipolarity is so relatively rare. You can speculate about it. I mean, you can think of it in terms of the obvious fact, which my Harvard colleague Graham Ellison, among others, have demonstrated, that bipolarity very often ends in cataclysmic war. So I mean that may be one of the reasons why it is relatively rare as a long-standing international system, right? It might also be that it's rare because it calls for a great deal of hegemonic power on the side, as it were, of the two poles. So they have to have the capacity to integrate others under the hegemony that they set up. So ideology is, of course, one way of doing it. There are other ways of doing it, but there has to be a relatively high degree of cohesion, or it won't work. Right? That's difficult. That's difficult to do. So that might be one of the reasons why it's relatively rare. But the real answer is I don't know. we haven't figured it out. So on the other question, so I think that's a combination of the ideological aspects, which I emphasize to some degree in this book, or to a high degree in this book, and power, capacity, capabilities that are there. So, and these go together. So I mean, it's important, I think, not to overemphasize one in the sense sort of exclusion over the other. So I explained the Cold War mainly as an ideological system. But if you ask the question, so why was the United States and Russia and the Soviet Union privileged among other states, you have to add to the hegemonic aspects of ideology the idea, the concept of two very large contiguous states with imperial pretensions that come out of the late 19th century. I mean, this is one of the reasons, as you know, why I started the book in the 1890s rather than the conventional way of actually looking at this from the mid-20th century onwards. That potentiality, that capacity, not yet demonstrated in the 1890s when the book starts, on the side of Russia and the United States, of course, one of the most significant reasons why these two then, making use of their relative ideologies, the respective ideologies, are able to transform an ideologically based conflict over onto an international state system after the 1940s.
I wondered if your experience of writing about the more distant past, and for example the past that you didn't yourself personally live through, for this most recent book, was different. And I wonder if you could more broadly talk about the challenges and advantages of writing about a time period that you experienced personally.
Advantages and disadvantages, right? So it's I find it generally more difficult to write about a time period that you have experienced yourself than to write about something that you haven't gone through. And that's for the natural kind of reasons: objectivity, being able to remove yourself enough from the equation to have a certain openness in terms of different kinds of interpretations and views of what's most important in terms of conflicts and forms of divides. On the other hand, I find it so much easier to get really engaged in terms of things that have been part of my own experience. So that's what sort of draws me to it. I think I'm in many ways a sort of blatantly presentist historian in that sense. I mean, and this goes for almost everything that I do. I'm interested in how a world today became the way we see it now, right? What created it? And that's what made me a historian in the first place. I was so damn curious about how things that otherwise may seem as being quite unlikely, improbable, ended up becoming established facts, right? So in that sense, I'm pulled towards the more recent past. But what I discovered in working on this book, and the last book as well, is that different from what I thought when I started out in this business, very often you have to go further back in history to explain what the situation is like today, further back than what I thought when I began. And that's what this book is about to quite some extent. I mean, I think it's impossible to understand why the Cold War became such an intense conflict in the late 20th century without understanding where it came from. So you have to be able to explain why people took it so incredibly seriously in terms of the ideological divide, first and foremost, but also other issues in terms of confrontation. Think about the willingness to prepare for the use of nuclear weapons in warfare. Well, I mean, you have to have a really strong belief in what you are doing is right in order to even contemplate that kind of thought. And I think that's impossible to understand for the people who were involved in the Cold War without understanding where they came from, without understanding the disasters of the early 20th century.
Well, this connects both to this question and previous questions about. So one of the things you talk about is the transformation from the 70s and 80s of the global economy and technology. It's key to the end of the Cold War. So to what extent then was there space for policy and agency in Washington and Moscow, or were they predetermined by the technological and financial changes of the 70s?
No, they were. All of this was connected to those changes that were taking place in a broader structural context. But, people make their own history. And this is certainly the case for the 1970s as well. So, there were huge structural changes taking place in the 1970s that delimited what people did and were capable of doing. So I think the economic transformation, the globalization of capitalism, if you wish, the explosion of financial capital on a global scale, is something that defines what goes on during the 1970s. And much of what is happening in politics is a response to that in one form or another. Now, was possible, to see that as not necessarily a good thing, or at least not in total a good thing, right? So you can oppose it, which quite a number of people actually did during the 1970s. Sometimes without seeing it clearly in terms of what was actually happening, but still being very skeptical of the social consequences that this had on a global scale. But in most cases, what happens when in this context, the sort of structure in a very acute form meets agency, right, is that people are slightly behind what is actually happening and then playing catch up. I mean, trying to figure out. Think about this in the United States, for instance. So the overarching idea in American politics during the 1970s was of US weakness, right? Vietnam, Watergate, Soviet links with revolutions in the Third World, these kinds of things, right? But in reality, what happened was a reconfiguration of global capitalism that really in many ways came to privilege the United States, right? So both in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere, people were playing catch up with that kind of development, which didn't become clear until about a decade later. And this is something that's really important for historians to try to work with. You have to study people in the context that they actually live in, but you will always see it with hindsight. Now, sometimes you say the benefit of hindsight, sometimes it is a benefit, sometimes it's a challenge. Going back to the earlier question, right? How do you actually do that? Well, you do it by studying what people thought or felt, and at that time, you do it through the sources that you have access to, not about what they feel today, but what they felt like back then. But you always have to bear in mind that you approach this from hindsight, that you know what some of the outcomes actually were.
For our final question, I think we might want to shift back and talk again about your general methodology in your career. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the practical and analytical challenges differ for younger scholars and older scholars who are practicing global or world history.
Well, ideally, of course, the challenges should be very similar. You go to this with a certain idea, certain concept or set of concepts about what you want to do, and then you try to test out whether this is actually held up in the sources that you're approaching. Now, one's lived experience obviously plays a role with regard to that. It plays a role with regard to how you ask the questions, what kind of questions you ask. Sometimes also with regard to what you think is possible to do, which is where younger scholars have an advantage over more established scholars. Because when you start out, certainly when I started out doing this kind of stuff, I had no idea what was possible to do. So therefore I tried a lot of different things, some of which worked out and others didn't work out. But looking back at this from later on, you sometimes think that you should have spent your time better, or I should have spent my time better doing things that I knew was possible. That's probably wrong, right? So that's the advantage that younger scholars have, is that you come up with new ideas, then you want to test them out. You find some of them do not work, right? Sometimes I fear that this enormous pressure that younger scholars, particularly in the humanities, are under with regard to publishing in order to get a job or keep a job that one already has, is very counterproductive with regard to this, because it is about testing and failing. It is about doing things again that haven't worked out the first time, right? And people should be given the space and the opportunity to actually do that. I also worry a little bit about how scholars who are starting out in their careers today pick their topics, and sometimes there is a premium that's being put today on being adventurous. So I mean, sometimes you are pushed in the direction of trying to be very innovative and revisionist, but without really having the opportunity for doing this, because you do not have the resources in terms of funding or in terms of capabilities. For instance, the opportunity to study a language that you're not entirely familiar with, because no one provides that kind of opportunity. So there is a kind of mismatch in a way between what you are supposed to do and what you have the resources for doing. And I don't think that's becoming any better. I think if anything, it's becoming worse. Right? So for young people who are starting out in this, like this wonderful group of people you have here at Max Weber, I mean, I think one of the most important things is to figure out what you're really, really interested in, and then simply proceed to do that, irrespective of the kind of pressures that are upon you from other directions. And I'm saying that not because it's ideally the right thing to do, as much that it's also usually the most productive thing to do, right? And it's what's long term usually has the best outcome.
Well, hopefully your work will help some of the more younger stuff. So
certainly my visit here has helped tremendously and focused my own mind on some of the issues I'm preoccupied with.
Thank you for the time and for the answers and
Thank you.
the attention.
Thought you enjoyed it. Thanks.
Bye.